There is going to be a lot in this particular PowerPoint video. We're going to start with reviewing what we've already learned about World War I, talk about what life was like during World War I, all the way to America getting involved in World War I, what effect did this have on American society, and then the actual end of the war. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify all of those things. So real quick review of this powder keg that existed in Europe. We talked about how with militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism were just waiting to explode. And that spark was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Again, just a quick review. You had the Allied powers. The Allied powers I really want you to focus on are Great Britain or England, France, and Russia. These are the Allied powers I would like you to really kind of think about. And then the Central powers are going to be Germany and Austro-Hungary. Now, again, remember, the war started because Germany and Austro-Hungary allied, and then Serbia and Russia allied. And that spark was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So the fighting started on August 3rd, 1914, and we discussed in the last video how Germany, no matter what happened, was going to have to fight a two-front war if war broke out. So they had already discussed how to deal with this, and this is known as the Schieffelin Plan. Now, the Schieffelin Plan has to have a couple of things work in order for it to be successful. And the Schieffelin Plan was Germany's plan to fight this two-front war. Germany would invade Belgium, and then take France. The reason they decided to go through France first is because Germany believed that it would take a while for Russia to mobilize. Now, in order for this to work, though, France will have to fall in a matter of weeks. So they will quickly have to take France. Then once France has fallen to the Germans, by train, transport all of their soldiers and supplies to the east coast of Germany. And by that time, they believe that Russia will have mobilized, and they will then be able to fight Russia. So with the Schieffelin plan, they believe, the Germans, that they will only have to fight a one-front war. But this doesn't happen because, one, Russia mobilizes a lot quicker than anticipated, and two, France does not fall as quickly as they had hoped. Now, Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, you see his picture down here in the lower right-hand corner. America's concern for free trade and American investments abroad led Woodrow Wilson to pursue a policy of neutrality, meaning they weren't going to take sides, either side. But this was hard for America because many people in America were children of immigrants or were immigrants themselves, and they naturally sided with what country they were from. So he begged Americans to be neutral in fact as well as in name, impartial in thought, as well in action. So it seemed that America at this time was not going to become involved in the war. So let's talk about what some of the war looked like. World War I is an interesting war because you have all of this new technology that is created, but the tactics have not yet caught up with it. And one of the main methods of fighting during World War I is going to be called trench warfare, where ditches are dug and men would dig in, stand post, and fight. And so you would have a ditch on one side. Now, these are fancy ditch. I mean, I don't want to say fancy, but they're not just like, it's enough to cover, you can see in this picture, a whole man. So then in land in between, that becomes known as no man's land. And this would be covered with mines, barbed wire, that kind of thing. And it was very dangerous to go over the top, which is what was called coming out of your trench and attacking, because they would have machine guns and be able just to mow people down. So trench warfare really caused war to be prolonged. Here is a diagram of trench warfare. You can see that these are some people who are going across no man's land. So their trenches would have been over here, the barbed wire right here, and then the system of trenches that exist here as well, that the men would be stationed at and be firing their machine guns at these men crossing no man's land. The new weapons that made really the number of people that die really increased were machine guns, especially in this trench warfare when you went over the top and went across no man's land. Airplanes were new to this war. Because of airplanes, you have anti-aircraft guns created. Chemical warfare also becomes a part of World War I with the use of poisonous gas. And in World War I, you will also see the use of tanks. Tanks are going to be crucial in this trench warfare because a tank was designed to be able to go across one of the trenches. Here's a photograph of those machine guns that are used. In this photograph in particular, they're actually wearing gas masks to protect in case that the enemy uses gas. Poison gas was very a horrible way to die. But poisonous gas was tricky because if the wind changed direction, instead of going to your enemy, it came on you. And poison gas wasn't just one of those things that, oh, they did it, we put on our mask for a little bit and it's gone. It would actually get into the trenches and sit there, and it'd take a really long time for it to get out, to the point where it sometimes forced the men to come out of the trenches in order to let the poisonous gas get out. Here is a model of a World War I airplane, or a picture of a World War I airplane. Again, not something I would want to go fly in, but these became very useful during World War I. You had famous pilots like the Red Baron that flew for Germany and they would just stick a gun on the airplane and shoot at people on the ground. This is a photograph of that anti-aircraft gun that was used because airplanes were now being used. They would now use these anti-aircraft. Airplanes were also used for reconnaissance, where they could fly over, get a view of where men were, where the enemy was, that kind of thing. So airplanes were used for a couple of reasons. Here's a picture of a World War I tank. Again, these tanks were used to go over trenches if needed be. They were slow, and again, these are the first tanks that are going to be used, so they weren't as effective as they could be. World War I, you had a lot of problems in the trenches. Water would collect, and men would get what is known as trench foot because their feet were exposed to water for a long time, and they didn't have a change of socks. They didn't have good enough boots to help protect their feet. And so a lot of times men would have to have their boots amputated. Their feet amputated. Other problems would be trench rats that would feed on the dead in the trenches. Also, body lice were a huge problem in the trenches during World War I. As the war goes on, America starts to question neutrality. By 1914, most Americans did not want to get involved. America tended, though, to sympathize with the nation from which their families originated, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And America actually has stronger economic ties with the Allies, so with England and France. And so economically, we seem to see ourselves tied more to that particular alliance, the Allied powers. One of the things that that the Germans used during World War I was submarine warfare, or U-boats. So U-boat right here is another word, Unterseeboot, or U-boat, a submarine, and they would use these to attack British ships. The British blockaded the German coast to prevent supplies from getting in. This is going to hurt America as well, because America couldn't sell goods to Germany, and Germany couldn't get food or extra supplies that they needed, because Germany is not a country with a lot of oil or anything, so they needed those supplies to come in. So the British Navy blockaded anything from getting into Germany. In order to fight this blockade, Kaiser Wilhelm decided to use U-boats. Now, these U-boats would attack anything. At first, they were just military ships. They would then attack British ships. They would attack British ships taking supplies to British armies. The British, because they were trying to get supplies, decided, hey, well, let's put our supplies on passenger ships, or ships that don't look like military ships, and the Germans did not care, so they started attacking those anyway. This became very dangerous, especially for passenger ships, for people who were traveling on them, because civilians would get killed when they were torpedoed. America is going to see the effects of this in May of 1915. The Lusitania was a passenger ship that was traveling from New York to Liverpool, which is in England. It had left on May 1st, 1915, and the Germans had warned Americans that traveling in these waters were dangerous, but many Americans were like, oh, whatever. And on May 7th, 6 days after its departure, on May 7th, 1915, it was torpedoed by a German U-boat. This ship sank in 18 minutes. 123 Americans were dead. 1,195 of the 1,959 on board Wait, that doesn't make sense. 1,959 of the 1,195 on board died. So almost every single person on board died, the sinking of this ship. Now, something that's going to make Americans mad are the killing of Americans. Now, this doesn't put America in the war, but it causes people to lean more towards that Allied alliance. Then in March of 1916, a German submarine sank another passenger ship known as the Sussex. Now, it doesn't completely sink, but 378 on board, at least 50 people were killed. After this, the Germans promised to compensate Americans injured on the Sussex and promised to warn neutral ships and passengers of vessels before attacking, but they would later break this promise. So again, America seems to be becoming more and more involved in this war, even though they don't want to. And the straw that really breaks the camel's back is the interception of the Zimmerman note or telegram in 1917. It was a message sent from Arthur Zimmerman, the former foreign secretary of the German Empire, to Heinrich von Eckert, the German ambassador of Mexico. So the German foreign secretary sends a message to the German ambassador in Mexico, and he wants to relay a message to the people of Mexico that, to the leaders of Mexico, that if America joins the war, that if Mexico joins on the side of Germany, Germany will help ensure that they receive lands that had once been taken from them. The British actually intercept this message and give it to the United States. When the United States reads this message, they see it as an act of war, and on April 2nd, 1917, America declares war. In Wilson's speech, he says, "The world must be made safe for democracy." Here's a copy if you want to pause and read through that telegram if you're interested. At this point, America mobilizes. Only 200,000 men were in the armed forces at the time when the war started. The American Expeditionary Force, it was U.S. armed forces sent to Europe during World War I. One of the leaders of these men is John J. Pershing. He wouldn't integrate his troops with the British and French. He led them to many victories. The Americans that fought in the American Expeditionary Force were known as doughboys, just a little thing to keep aware. You also had the passage of the Selective Service Act, which means that men were drafted into war. Just another little side note, Herbert Hoover would serve on the Commission for Relief in Belgium, and the U.S. had to expand its Navy. So America starts getting into this production mode, and this is going to play a huge role when we start talking about the Great Depression. One American that I would like you to be aware of is a man named Alvin C. York. He's actually from Pall Mall, Tennessee. You can see this little circle right here in the area of Tennessee that he is from. Alvin C. York didn't want to fight. He was a conscientious objector initially. And this is an individual who has claimed the right to refuse to perform military service on the grounds of freedom of thought, conscience, and or religion, a pacifist. Now, even though you refuse to fight, you could be drafted to serve in non-combat roles. Eventually, though, he will serve and become one of the most decorated men in World War I and be awarded the Medal of Honor. America will use, when the war starts, a convoy system in order to combat the use of German U-boats. A convoy system is a group of merchantmen or troop ships traveling with a naval escort. So when supplies are being shipped across the sea, a naval escort would be there to protect it. From 1917 to 1918, only 154 of the over 16,000 ships that were sent had been sunk. So it's hugely successful, this convoy system. As the Progressive Congress gives power to Wilson, you have the creation of the War Industries Board in 1917. It was established to coordinate the purchase of war supplies. It encouraged mass production and set production quotas. The war economy, you had the establishment of the National War Labor Board, and this was to arbitrate disputes between workers and employers to try to prevent any type of labor disputes or strikes during wartime, so that wartime supplies could be created and that the soldiers would not suffer. You also had food rationing. Americans were told you can only have so much food, buy so much food in order to save that. For the soldiers, people voluntarily rationed. They would start growing their own food in their own gardens. These became known as victory gardens. America also had to raise money for the war. So in order to sell the war, you had loans and bonds sold, so American could buy a war bond and eventually sell it back for a profit, and America used those sales to help finance the war. You also had the creation of the Committee on Public Information, or the Creel Committee. They were going to use propaganda in order to encourage Americans to support the war. This is one of the more famous pieces of propaganda that will come out of World War I. Destroy the Mad Brute. Again, this lovely woman here is to represent America and democracy, and this ape, this brute, is wearing one of the German military helmets and is representing Germany. Because of German fear of the Germans, you have this anti-immigration hysteria that grows. Many Americans with German names lost their jobs. They felt like maybe they were being spies. Orchestras refused to play Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Brahms, who are German composers. Schools stopped teaching German. Really, they just feared the role that Germany was playing in the world, and it led to people just really kind of boycotting Germany. In 1917 and 1918, you have the passage of the Espionage Acts. Espionage prohibit interference with military operations or recruitment. You were fined $10,000 and 20 years in jail for interfering with the war or speaking out against the United States. So espionage is spying. Sedition is the extension of espionage. It covers freedom of speech. So they could actually remove your right to the freedom of speech through the Sedition Acts. This is actually going to come to head in the Supreme Court in Schnick versus United States in 1919. Charles Schnick was distributing leaflets to draft-age men urging resistance to induction. He was told he couldn't do this. He went to the Supreme Court saying his rights were being violated. But the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the United States, supporting the Sedition Acts. Eugene V. Debs will be in prison during World War I because of speaking out against the war. African Americans there's two sides to the war. When it came to supporting war, many African Americans supported the war, but then you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois who supported the war. And then you had William Monroe Trotter, who believed African Americans shouldn't support a racist government, because why should we fight for democracy abroad when not all African Americans have it here at home? But like I said, most African Americans did support the war. Women in the war, because the men were out to fight, women took up jobs that men often had: railroad workers, cooks, stock workers, and bricklayers. They also formed the women. You also have a group of women who did not support the war, and they created the Women's Peace Party. Here you can see some women working factories. Women also joined the war effort as nurses, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner. American troops go on the offensive. Russia pulled out of the war in 1917 due to a revolution. This is going to be a huge upset to the Allies, but America's entry really helps the Allied effort. The U.S. and the Allies put down Germany in August 1918. Austro-Hungary surrendered. November 1918, Germany agreed to a ceasefire. And overall, 22 million people would die. That's about 6,000 people a day dying in this war. It was horrible event in the world history. So November 1918, Germany finally agreed to a ceasefire. This is actually November 11th, which would become known as Veterans Day, that we celebrate now. In January of 1919, they hold a peace conference in Paris. Many people will bring forth their ideas of what peace should look like after the war. Wilson puts forth his 14 points in January of 1918 before the war was over. He declared World War I was fought for moral reasons, calling for post-war peace. He wanted free trade, open agreements, and self-determination. He becomes emotionally associated with the creation of the League of Nations, which I'll talk about in a second. An association of nations for mutual agreement. And so the League of Nations really is Wilson's baby, where everybody would send in a representative to talk out problems, to prevent something that happened like during World War I. So an international organization to discuss world matters and to settle grievances and would prevent future world wars. World leaders would meet at what is known as the Treaty of Versailles that would end the actual war. The leaders of Britain and France wanted Germany to pay. Germany and Russia weren't allowed in the treaty process. So the big four there are going to be Italy, America, France, and Britain. By making Germany pay, they felt that Germany should pay for all the war damages that it caused. But if you think about it, you're a country that just lost a war. You're not going to have a lot of money to pay for damages, and this really puts Germany in a tight spot. At this treaty, this is where Wilson's really going to push for his League of Nations. But where Wilson really runs into trouble with the Treaty of Versailles is in America, and I'll get to that in a second. Because of the Treaty of Versailles, you have the creation of 3 new nations when land was carved out: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. They carved out different borders for other countries, and they divided the Ottoman Empire into 5 areas and gave them to France and Britain as mandates. Also, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany wasn't allowed to maintain an army. They had to return Alsace-Lorraine to France and had to pay reparations. Those are damages or war monies of $33 billion to the Allies. This actually was not paid off until September of 2010. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is never ratified by the United States. This is something that you need to know. The United States felt that by joining the League of Nations and the signing the Treaty of Versailles, they would have to give up their sovereignty. So the Treaty of Versailles was never ratified by the United States. That doesn't mean that it didn't go into effect for Europe. America just didn't sign it. They didn't want to join the League of Nations. They never joined the League of Nations. This is going to make the League of Nations very, very weak. And as we talk about the causes of World War II, I want you to remember this, because the weakness of the Treaty of Versailles is going to be a huge, huge cause of World War II. So what were these weaknesses? Germany had to take sole responsibility for the war. They had to pay huge reparations. They lost their Pacific colonies. Russia actually lost more land than Germany. The treaty ignored claims of colonized people for self-determination, and Americans thought it was too harsh. They thought that Germany shouldn't have been treated as badly as it had been. So all of these weaknesses in the treaty. This is what I was just talking about a second ago. Many Americans opposed the League of Nations because it violated the U.S.'s policy of isolationism, of staying out of business. So America never joined the League of Nations. The treaty didn't really resolve anything. People in Europe weren't satisfied. It set the stage for Hitler to take over in World War II, and we'll talk more about that when we get to World War II.